We all have lots of trauma one way or another. We put band-aids on it and we have coping mechanisms. The process of following the path of insight means you actually have to rip all those band-aids off and deal with all that trauma, because otherwise it's like this autonomic trigger that you don't notice that provokes behaviors that leads to wallowing in emotion. So you've got to deal with it. But you might not be ready to deal with it, or you might not have the strength to deal with it. And sometimes people may not have the concentration to deal with it, so they get an insight into their trauma or into something that triggers trauma and have a very negative reaction. Go, oh my God, the world is nothing like what I ever thought. And one part of your brain goes amazing. Another part of your brain freaks out and goes, oh, no, I'm not listening. I don't want to hear that. Go away. This language is very linear and limited to working memory. It has low information density, whereas a human existence has high information density. Generate insights that are useful.
Hello, Malcolm. Thank you so much for being here with us for Chung Huong Institute podcast, all the way from New Zealand.
It's my pleasure, Sri Chandra.
Malcolm, could you share with us a little bit more about who you are?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor of marketing. I hold an endowed chair at Massey University in marketing, and I've had a long career in that area, particularly working on stochastic models of biobehavior and cognitive aspects of information processing and on survey research methodologies. But I have pretty broad interests. So I'm also a martial arts master. And I have had a very substantive insight meditation practice as well. And I work with a lot of different people around the world in different areas. So I work in climate science with the Southampton Marine and Maritime Institute. And I work in shopper behavior with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute in Australia. And I work on meditation and mindfulness with Harvard Medical School, the Center for Meditation Research at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I'm an affiliated researcher. And I have appointments at the other places, adjunct professor in Australia and visiting professor in the UK. So, I'm well through my career, I guess, and, have a family and just trying to enjoy every day.
Amazing. Yeah, I think of martial arts. You mentioned before we started the call, Aikido, and my only experience with Aikido is learning how to fall.
Yeah, actually it's Hapkido. So Korean, Aikido is Japanese. They do have the same root in Daitoryu Aiki Jiu-Jitsu, but Hapkido is, very distinctively Korean. There's aspects of Korean culture that infuse it. But yes, it is a lot of the same stuff. So yeah, we do throws and grapples and joint locks and pressure points and kicking and punching and sparring and patterns and weapons and all of that kind of stuff. And I do find that very rewarding and also just fantastic whole body, whole system exercise as well.
How does this all work? I mean, martial arts, mindfulness, insight, you teach in the United States, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, doing so much work.
Yeah, well, I only teach in New Zealand. It's researching in the other areas. I think part of it is just, being a little bit older. So as you go through life, you pick up different attributes. And part of it is just being driven by curiosity and desire just to flourish a little bit and explore the capabilities that I have. And part of it, of course, is decades of going, things don't feel right somehow. There's some sort of sense of dukkha and thinking, maybe if I just achieve more, I can overcome that, until I eventually worked out that wasn't the solution.
Yeah, dukkha, suffering. And you mentioned before we got on the call that perhaps this is something to do with clinging. And many people, right, they jump. They're like, I need this, I need that, I need this position, etc. And the mind goes crazy.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I think that's because we don't know our minds, or a default position is we don't know our minds. So we don't see the clinging operating, so we become slaves to it, right? It arises in reaction to something, and that triggers some kind of, emotional reaction and wallowing. And, as a result, we undergo a process of, creating new reactive tendencies that just reinforce that whole cycle of the origination of suffering. So as you know, Suchandra, it requires a lot of effort to see that and to understand it fully and to unwind it and rewire the brain so that it no longer experiences those kind of effluents of autonomic reactions to events that are out of our control. So I think that seems to be the default state, right? We think that we have this state of ignorance that leads us to think, oh, there's this thing I can possess, and I'm me, and I can possess that, and I can bind it into me, and we don't really understand that they're just all ephemeral processes that we've applied some layer of abstraction to, and so of course we can never possess them properly because the whole way we're perceiving them is fundamentally erroneous. So no matter how much we do, there's still the sense of, oh, that didn't quite work out. There's some kind of unsatisfactoriness there. So as a result, we without doing the work to overcome that, we're constantly going, oh, I want that, or I want to avoid this, or all these attempts to create homeostasis in the organism by seeking to acquire things or avoid things. And to me, that is clinging. It's any kind of movement away or movement towards that's arising sort of semi-autonomously or autonomically that we don't really observe and see, and is in effect pulling our strings, being our puppet master. So I see it clinging as a fairly broad set of these subconscious behaviors that make us these unthinking emotional beings.
How do you work with that, Malcolm?
Uh, well, do you mean personally?
Personally, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
on top of your own work, right?
yeah, yeah.
You have a family, and you're doing the spiritual work as well, the mundane work, the spiritual work, the family life. I mean, what's that work look like, really? The deep work of transformation.
So the deep work of unwinding clinging is ultimately the greater sutra on the four foundations of mindfulness, right? Everything is in there in my view. I mean, you can talk about maybe there's a bit more that's required in terms of compassion practices and flourishing, and all leads on to the Mahayana route, right? To say, oh well, there's something a little bit thin or missing in the basic Theravada stuff. But in terms of working with the clinging itself, yeah, it's all there. And so I think there's a whole heap of practices that can be applied, and they all need to be applied, and they may need to be applied. Well, you can apply them in different orders, but you need to consecutively address all of those foundations of mindfulness. It's like in the Anapanasati Sutra as well, right? The progress through body, emotions, mind, and dharmas, which I would call the perceptual construction of self and reality, is what I understand by dharmas and that. And so some start at different areas, right? Maybe Tibetans tend to start more at mind, right, or even at dharmas. If you look at the particular stages, starting at non-duality, whereas breath meditation is obviously starting at the body, and compassion-based practices are starting at emotions. But you've got to do them all, at some stage and in some way, no matter the order. You've got to do them all, and you've got to follow those practices. And I think that the real key is to treat mindfulness as a way of being, and it's not to say every second, but it's a habit of your life. to observe the things that arise and see clearly what's happening. And I think, to see it really clearly, if you can observe the arising of things 2 or 3 times a day, even, and just watch the three characteristics, the impermanence, right, of them, the fact that they're not you. There's something that is not essentially your nature. It's just a component that is, porously connected, and that it only becomes a source of suffering if clung to bring back clinging. And if you can see the three characteristics of things that are arising in your life a few times a day, I think that's fantastic. And, that's the four foundations of mindfulness, all the things that might arise, and how to work with them. But it's very extensive. There's no one way. I've heard the phrase, there's 80,000 doors to the Dharma, right? Well, I added it up once in the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, and I could only get to about 6,000, I think it was, 4 or 6,000 or something, but close enough, right? There's lots of different ways to do it. You don't have to do them all, but I think that is the way to work with it. Ultimately, is that mindfulness throughout the day. But having said that, of course, you might have to do preparatory practices to have the ability to do that, right? To have the concentration and the calm and the insight to do that. So preparatory practices may be necessary as well, but I think ultimately it's mindfulness.
You speak directly to my heart on that, because I actually just finished teaching a class at California Institute of Integral Studies, and the whole class, now we've been teaching this class for a year and a half, and it's all in the four foundations of mindfulness. And I keep seeing this is an infinite practice. I mean, besides my own practice, but sharing with others and seeing how far it can go. And I'm curious, Malcolm, when you're doing research, a lot of students, when they write, they lose their mindfulness. They're just so tired. So, like, what is mindful writing? Like, how do we apply these ancient concepts to our modern academic and professional lives?
Well, to me, one thing is an interesting question there is how much do you maintain an absorption, right? Because you can have an absorption of mindfulness as well. And this is required at some stages. And this is the advice in the Sutta and the soteriological promise, right? That if you stay absorbed, not for 7 decades, not for 7 years, not for 7 months, not for 7 weeks, but just 7 days, you will achieve arhat or anagami if there's some remaining clinging. Now that is not 3 or 4 times a day. That's like an absorption for 24 hours a day, which is a different thing. And we obviously engage in absorptions in other ways as well, through jhana or retreat and so forth. So I think one mistake that people make is to think that therefore the way of being is to be constantly absorbed in these things. And I think that's not really right and can lead to difficulty. Because to be constantly absorbed, you have to suppress a lot of your humanity. And then if you're suppressing stuff, it tends to kind of pop out in other ways, in ego extensions. So you often see this, right? People who are just absolutely absorbed in high jhanic states often have weird ego extensions. It kind of can pop out. Not always, but sometimes. Now, the reason I said that is to come back to mindful writing, right? So I would not say mindful writing is a matter of being absorbed in mindfulness while writing. I think it's just the more of the like the 3 times a day kind of mindfulness, maybe a little bit more often, but just to think about what you're doing and be reflective on it. But having said that, of course, you can also get in a flow state while writing, and I think that's really good too. But that's not really a mindfulness absorption. That's a separate thing. It's like it's sure, maybe it's related because jhanas are maybe some kind of flow state, we could argue, but it's not really a meditative process. It's a separate, related kind of process. So I'm all in favor of getting into a flow state, while writing, but also just being mindful of, why are you writing this? What are the key points? What are you trying to achieve? And balancing that mindful reflection on the purpose, content, structure, and effectiveness of the writing with the flow state that seems to, produce the hopefully wonderful prose.
And you being a specialist with marketing, Malcolm, I just kind of want to reel us back to our intention initially, and this conversation is way too interesting. I feel like I can hog off the whole mindfulness sphere for neon with you. How can marketing itself be also a mindfulness practice or a contemplative practice, right? Like doing this work, people are, especially on social media, everyone's trying to promote themselves. They're trying to see how to become known.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I think, I seem to have frozen. Can you see me?
Yes, you're good.
That's okay. So I think, that can be a real source of clinging, right? Because you're going, how can I promote myself? How can I get an audience? How can I do this? How can I do the other? And there's like an orgy of clinging on social media as people try to find ways to engage with others. And, there's a sort of like a vacuity and rational process sometimes in favor of just trying to get this emotional processing and emotional reactions. So I think that's very unhelpful. It's spiritually extremely unhelpful aspect of our modern society because it drags people away from mindfulness. As a marketing academic, I wouldn't characterize that as marketing so much as, part of the whole sort of FANG, as they were called, Facebook, Meta now, of course, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple. FANG, yeah. So, that process of building these IT businesses and getting interactions. So, I think we ought to be pretty careful about social media interaction and be mindful of the risk of just sort of vacating our capacity for discrimination in favor of just wallowing in the emotion. And I think that's the key thing, to ask yourself, are you just wallowing in this? Because it's part of modern life, right? We can't avoid it, but we can try not to wallow. It's the wallowing, I think, that is the real issue. So then, coming back to other kinds of marketing, I think of it in terms of like marketing decision making and budgeting and advertising decisions and survey research and creating the brand and product development and all of that. It's just work. It's like being behind the plow, right, or in the rice paddy or what have you. And you can be mindful about it. It's good to be mindful about it, as it is any other aspect of your life. But I wouldn't distinguish it in any way as being special, right? It's just saying, oh, well, try not to cling. You can be absorbed in it. That can be good to get into a flow state, to get more work done and to operate intuitively, can be good. But just try to be mindful of how your mind is operating and make sure that you're in charge of what your mind is doing instead of your limbic system or your emotions being in charge of your mind and just pulling the strings without you realizing that's what's happening.
Say more about the limbic system being in control of the emotions. We're so heavily emotionally focused in our modern world, right? I haven't been to New Zealand, but I'm going to assume human nature is the same there.
Yeah, well, it's quite complex. Now, I've got to say, I'm not a biologist or a neurobiologist, so I talk about the limbic system perhaps more metaphorically than accurately. But with that caveat, I mean, I have studied information processing and decision making quite a lot. And to some extent, there's a system one, system two thing going on, right? And in that we're sometimes making fast decisions and sometimes slow decisions. But I think actually both can be either emotional or rational, right? Because we can mull things over and have slow emotional decisions, and we can make fast cognitive snap judgments based on the contents of working memory, or slow deliberative ones where we go through some kind of search and elaborative process to resolve a problem. So it's a little more complex than I think Kahneman and Tversky originally proposed. And we also have, I think, on that intuitive or emotional side, quite a lot of things going on there. And I'm a great fan of Damasio's concept of somatic markers. I think that's really useful in understanding that biographical memory traces can be overlaid with some kind of effect, all right, with some kind of emotion. And that then when we make decisions, we often just take in all the salient memory traces and weigh up that effect, and that gives us a sort of a yes or no. And to me, that has vastly more information processing power than cognitive analysis through working memory, which is maybe 5 or 7 items at a time. You can extend it by putting some of your working memory in Excel or something, right? But it's still more limited. Whereas the effective analysis can weigh up vastly more information. And again, you can sort of mull it over to make more information available to you. So now that's only one element of emotion, okay? And if you look at, say, Buddhist doctrine, and you look at say Vedana, right, and 5 aggregates of clinging, right? It's an aggregate. It's a heap of clinging. So it's not one thing. It's actually standing in place of a whole lot of processes there. So just looking at purely Vedana, which is a bit like effect, approach, avoid, is a sort of a simplification. And obviously there's more to the emotion and the subconscious, right? There's emotional reactions, and you can look at emotion wheels to try to understand that. I haven't particularly done that, but I know that they exist of the range of emotions. And there's also symbolic communication that's going on, right? In dreams or elsewhere. The subconscious communicates in that way. So, we don't understand it fully, but what we can see pretty obviously if we do the work to look at it is that these emotions or this range of non-rational aspects of information processing are having huge control over us, and that they set our agenda, right, of what we think about. They help us to frame it in terms of how we think about it, and they actually are one of the decision-making processes that we use, not the only decision-making process. We can go to rationality as well, right? But people who are hyper-rational or pretend they're hyper-rational are often slaves to their emotions when it comes to setting the agenda and framing it, right? So they go, I'm going to make the absolute rational decision, but they are not mindful of how the agenda is set, and which seems to be done emotionally, or how it is framed, right, which is always contextual. I think some people also think, oh, we should get rid of those emotions or suppress them. And, I think that is just to suppress your humanity and creates an enormous amount of potential trouble. Instead, I think we need to be aware of them and the role they're playing and bring them into our consciousness, so that then we can make a choice about whether we react in that way or not, so that we're not just automatically reacting, seeing this as part of us that binds in some external object, but we can say, this is arising. It's arising for a while. It's not me, but I can integrate it into the processes that form my psychophysical beings, but I have a choice about it. So I see emotions as enormously important because they tend to be suppressed and we don't understand them really. And by that, I mean the whole heap of things that we'd put in that emotional category. But also there's like this major source of clinging, because when we are not mindful of them and they sort of trigger us, they're part of that whole triggering process, we become prone to wallowing in them. And it's that wallowing in emotion that directly creates the neuroreactive tendencies, or karma, if you like, if you look at it as being in this very lifetime. Right. It's so yeah. So I'm not saying emotions are bad. Emotions are fantastic. Being human is fantastic. Being human is the best of the realms, right? It's great. But to be fully human, we have to integrate all of those aspects of who we are and be aware of them, and operate with understanding and integration and acceptance and joy.
I love this. And I love how you say that the people who are very rational actually tend to be more emotional. Because I've always thought, the one who's like, I'm type A, and it's an excuse for being mean, often.
Yeah. That's right. But equally, another way to look at it is it's like seeking. There's a seeking that goes on in that personality. It's going, I'm trying to make sense of the world and how I interact with it. So I've found a frame of reference that seems to have some success, right? And this frame of reference, I've got these scripts I can borrow from people's work on this, and it seems to have some success, and I'm reducing some of my sense of unsatisfactoriness and propping up my sense of self, right? I achieve, therefore I am, and so consequently, yeah, I think it's like the side effect is, sure, maybe sometimes people can be mean to others, but it's like I don't think they set out to be mean in most cases.
Yeah.
It's more like, this is part of how I'm trying to deal with my own sense of unsatisfactoriness, is I'm borrowing this, set of memory structures and ideas and ways of being that will lead to some success that helps me to feel a little bit better. And part of that is maybe being robust in discussions or demanding or whatever else. So, I think again, feel compassion for that partial solution. And, if it's harming others, compassion for those that are harmed. But also it's like, well, it's not really the answer, right? It's couldn't they do better? Hopefully, maybe one day they will. Or if they're happy enough, well, that's fine as well, because the path is long and difficult, and it's not for everyone. So if someone's happy enough, good luck to them. But hopefully they can operate with compassion and not harm others.
How does your work, like you're balancing the left and right brain, and we're doing in this conversation in many ways, right?
Yeah.
I'm seeing this. But how do you really balance this kind of left and right spheres? I know they've debunked the myth of left and right brain anyway, but
As a metaphor, as a frame of reference, right?
as a frame of reference.
And I think, as an aside, if you're really committed to science, everything we know is wrong. because it will all be improved over time. We'll get better theories. So this is another source of clinging, right? Is to go, something is right and it's true, but of course it doesn't take much to sort of debunk that. But coming back to your question, I think it's we all have different things we're good at and not so good at. And for me, it's like where I have some skills and abilities, I like to try to develop them and help them to flourish. So, I have both analytic abilities and creative abilities, if we can put it that way. So I just like to expand them all and help them to flourish. And I think part of that, it's helped by going, well, there is no like central essential self that has a particular set of characteristics. There's just this ongoing, ever evolving process with porous boundaries to the environment that consists of a bunch of aggregates, right? And I can work with any and all of those aggregates and help them and develop them and encourage them to be more of what is possible. So I think if you do take the view that we are aggregates of diverse processes, then there's no particular need to cling to one process or another, but just to go where things take you and explore the possibilities for unfolding that are there in any particular way. And so I have a lot of skills and a lot of abilities that I've developed over time, but others that I'm not so good at, and probably never will be, and that's that's not a gain. It's not a lack. It's just what is, and I just try to enjoy what is.
I love that. You mentioned the aggregate several times, but you also, without mentioning the word, but you mentioned this kind of interdependence, right? Everything being interdependent to one
Yeah.
another. So, can you just tell us a little bit more of how do you explain this to your students? I mean, you're teaching in these Western universities. You're teaching in these places where I don't know. Can you just say like, "Hey, you're a slave to your mind right now"?
Uh, well, I don't teach mindfulness and meditation in the universities, so it doesn't really arise. It's I think um, it can generate insights that are useful to people, and you can provide targeted insights that arise from this kind of knowledge, but it doesn't mean you have to explain the whole system. Because the interdependence makes it difficult to explain because language is very linear and limited to working memory, right? So it has low information density, whereas human existence has high information density. So you need, that's where poetry is quite good, right? Because it has higher information density than prose. I think you can think of it mathematically, and I've kind of proposed that in one of my papers in a sense that we're like a 12 dimensional tensor or a fractal matrix with 12 dimensions. And you can't explain that in language very easily. You can only point to it. You could explain it in mathematics if you had enough precise measurement. Funnily enough, mathematicians have exactly the same problem, right? They can't explain some of what they're doing in language because it's similarly complex information. So I don't try, but where I get an insight that is useful within a frame of reference, I'll share that. But as I say, I'm not teaching mindfulness and meditation. So this is more around marketing. But certainly, I have mentored a lot of students. So I definitely draw on the insights I've gained to try to provide ones that are useful for them where they are at that time with what they're trying to do as part of their development.
What do you think would happen if universities, or maybe we even take it further, if all the way from elementary school, these kind of qualities that you've spoken of within mindfulness, within the understanding of the aggregates, with the understanding of everything being interdependent, if we were able to really bring that into schools, into universities, what changes would happen?
Well, there might be a mental health crisis.
Really?
Yeah, because the thing is, we all have lots of trauma, right, one way or another, and we paper that over, and we put band-aids on it, and we have coping mechanisms. And the process of following the path of insight means you actually have to rip all those band-aids off and deal with all that trauma, because otherwise it's like this trigger, right? This autonomic trigger that you don't notice that provokes behaviors that leads to wallowing in emotion. So you've got to deal with it, but you might not be ready to deal with it, or you might not have the strength to deal with it. And sometimes people, may not have the concentration to deal with it. So they get an insight into their trauma or into something that triggers trauma and have a very negative reaction. So, this is in the Carmelite Christian tradition. They talk about the dark night of the soul, and that's been borrowed in Buddhist traditions as well, and the dukkhanas, or even worse than that, a different thing, falling into the pit of the void. And I think notoriously meditative techniques can provoke these reactions because they can happen by surprise as well, that you get a sudden insight and go, oh my God, the world is nothing like what I ever thought. It's actually completely different. And one part of your brain goes, amazing, that's fantastic. And another part of your brain freaks out and goes, oh, no, I'm not listening. I don't want to hear that. Go away. And so you set up these psychological conflicts. And as as you're unable to integrate. So, the research we've done, and it's only preliminary, suggests that probably breath and body meditation is pretty safe, but reality distorting practices really massively increase the risk. So, for example, past psychedelic use, past occult, divine, or magical practice use, just total amount of practice, total dose of practice as well. And also contemplation of mysteries, which is like both a Christian and a Buddhist practice. These all really increase the risk of negative outcomes, or, of having, not only of having sudden unusual mental and somatic events like, Kundalini awakening, or, popping into some kind of non-dual state, or, whatever it might be, but suffering after those events. So I think that's really kind of interesting question for those wanting to spread mindfulness and meditation, is how to do it safely. And, at the moment, I would say two elements are clear. One is basic practices, kind of probably okay, but more advanced practices do carry a risk. So, so be careful about more advanced practices. And also just, for people teaching those practices, are they aware of the risks, and do they have a support network that can enable some kind of intervention that would support people who are undergoing these problems? And also, as part of that, trying to educate the medical community as well, to say, look, this is normal. It's not someone's going crazy, because, there are anecdotes of people being medicated or even institutionalized for going through spiritual experiences. And there's something in the DSM now around that, but it's still pretty basic, and saying, no, you actually need to know a lot more about this. It's a really widespread, and it's not just meditation, right? It's a part of the human condition. We found 13% of the population to be studied had experienced moderate or greater suffering after some kind of emergent phenomenology. So there's already actually a hidden public health epidemic out there, where people are having these spiritual adjacent experiences, out of body experiences, whatever, and kind of freaking out about them one way or another. So that's already happening. The risk is maybe spread of mindfulness contributes to it, because sometimes it doesn't take a very high dose for someone to have an insight. And if we spread it further, maybe it might contribute more. So I would say, again, we just have to be mindful, right? Not just say, let's just spread it, but go, all right, how do we do so in a way that's safe and supportive? And how do we build a whole ecosystem around it? So yeah, that's you've probably touched on a point of interest there, but I think we have to be at least a little bit careful.
It seems like the big question here is, what makes a qualified teacher? I mean, nowadays everyone's like, I'm going to go for a teacher training for 1 month, for a few weeks, and then they're a teacher who doesn't practice, who actually doesn't understand, doesn't know, but everybody's a qualified, certified mindfulness teacher, or
Yeah,
contemplative practice, right?
something else to cling on to. Yeah, I exist because I'm a mindfulness teacher. I have an enduring separate essence of, of mindfulness. I mean, that's maybe a little unfair. People, we're all on a journey, right? And you could say we're all on different stages of the journey, but even the concept of a stage is a fabrication, right? We all exist. We're here in some way. That existence might be an emergent property of a complex system, but that doesn't make it any the less miraculous, I think, and amazing. And it's to be celebrated. So, I guess it's human nature to say, oh, well, here's something I can cling on to, right? And so who are we to argue against human nature? I mean, you can look at, say, in yoga, they might have various levels of training. Say, oh, you've done I don't know the hours, the 40-hour course, the 150-hour course, whatever it might be. I don't know. Does that help? I don't know. I would think what would be really useful is for people who do want to teach in this area to maybe have some understanding of how all of these practices all of the insight practices sort of arise from the Mahasarapathani Sutta and maybe also the Anapanasati Sutta. So, as a basic level, just at least know those suttas. Obviously, there's a bit more on compassion practices and some of the Tibetan non-dual stuff. It's sort of implied in those, but it's not really, brought out all that much. So I think just having some knowledge of where things come from and what they mean and why and how they slot in is really good. And then I think just having some knowledge of the path of insight and what people might strike along the way and how to help them and how to know when you're out of your depth and to get some help. I think those things would be good to be part of teacher training. But at the end of the day, we're all on our individual journeys, and I wouldn't want to require too much of anyone and say it must be this way, it must be that way, it must be the other way, because maybe they've got some ideas that I don't, that are better, and I'd hate to suppress them.
Sound like a true researcher. That here's the idea, here's what I think, and something better will come along.
I hope so. Thank you.
I also love how you mentioned the roots, the foundation, right? Like how to prevent this appropriation of whatever practice being learned and taught, and perhaps that is in itself a gateway.
Yeah, I think just we lack theory a lot in popular science and popular education and also in meditation and teaching. And I think when people don't understand where things come from and the theoretical reason for them, that does create opportunities for things to go awry or for poor quality work to be done. Because if you don't know why you're doing it, you might go, oh, well, it must be this way, and form an incorrect conclusion. And then, from that, adopt an incorrect practice. So, I think people who do want to do their own thing, it's just a good idea to know why things were done the way they were in the first place before you deviate. Otherwise, you're not even aware that you're deviating or what the problems might be. So, yeah, I'm a great fan of understanding a little bit of the why.
Yes, thank you. Now let's go back to marketing for a moment. Because that's what you're teaching in New Zealand. So when we look at marketing, we look at these contemplative practices. Now, can contemplative disciplines like mindfulness, can it shape how we apply marketing science in real life? How do we apply to behavior change even?
Yeah, so let's be a little clear on the question. I mean, to some extent, what we've been doing is applying survey research techniques developed through marketing to measure what is going on in general populations. But it's also in terms of understanding how to ask questions and what's going on in the mind is really important. So something that is important to me is to understand memory structures and to some extent the construction of the self, or at least biological traces, because these affect how you can get information out of people and understanding how they process information. So, when I write a survey, I will realize that one of the things I have to do is to make the relevant memories salient. So you have to kind of have a warm-up phase and go general and then narrow so that you can make the things you're interested more easily recalled. But also to distinguish what's going on in the mind. And I think this is a real problem often in marketing is people mix up sort of attitudes and beliefs. Or if you look at the three components of an attitude, traditionally the cognitive, affective, and the conative, or the action oriented. I think the action oriented or conative, we have specific ways of measuring. Sometimes in marketing, people use an intent, a purchase intent. Better measures are purchase probabilities or purchase choices or obviously looking at actual purchase data. Um, but the cognitive and affective are interesting because people often mix them up and ask attitude questions about things that are not really attitudes, that are just things that happen to be in memory at the moment. So in my research, I'm always very keen to say, well, an attitude is an enduring disposition. That should be some kind of somatic marker. It should arise from those processes that cause an affective overlay on a biographical trace. So if you want to measure that, you actually have to try to prompt recall of those biographical traces, memory traces with the affective overlays, and measure something that is likely to be a result of past experience resulting in an ongoing reactive tendency. Whereas if you want to measure the cognitive component, you can do it through accessing the contents of working memory, which we do through attribute associations or word associations. It's probably all a bit technical, Suchandra, but I think that's very important, and so that's what I do in designing surveys, including in the study of mindfulness and meditation, is to just try to understand the differences between memory networks and effective biographical memory traces, and to have some construct validity in what I'm measuring, and to regard the person not as a database, but as a person who's having an interaction with the questionnaire, and so needs to be prepared and led through and respected, and then we can gather stuff that is construct valid and related to identifiable neurobiological processes, and then we can avoid mixing up like cognitive and affective stuff, as is unfortunately very often done in marketing. To bring it back, of course, this is all about understanding the mind, right? So again, there's a bit of a link to the Dharma in that if you understand the mind, well, of course, you can better interact with other people's minds as well.
Thank you. I love, again, you integrate so well this left-right brain theory. Is this similar to the work you're doing with the Center for Meditation Research?
Yes, yes. So we're working on survey research data about the prevalence of unusual somatic and mental effects, and the risk factors for these, and the risk factors for subsequent suffering. I'm also doing some theoretical work on areas related to the mind as well. So we published a paper pretty much looking at developing a functionalist theory of the mind from Buddhist doctrine as a sort of an intermediate theory that would sit between contemplative experiences and neuroscience, because we're saying, well, we need intermediate theory because to enable these things to be scientifically studied, because otherwise the gap is too big. We got Jay Sanguinetti and Shinzen Yang on that paper. I don't know if you've heard of Shinzen. He's quite a well-known teacher. As Matthew said, to like check the math, as it were. Not that there's any maths, but you appreciate it. So that was great. So there's a bit of the so some of it's empirical with the surveys, and some of it's theoretical with work like that. And we've just sent off something also looking at active inference as well as a means of explaining meditative phenomena. So there's a mix of those two, the survey research and the theoretical cognitive science.
Incredible, Malcolm. If people want to learn more about your work, and how can they do that?
Well, we've got stuff that's open access in clinical psychological science and mindfulness. So there are 3 open access articles there. I would say go into those. The easiest way to find them is probably to go to my Google Scholar profile. So I'm Professor Malcolm Wright with a Wright, of Massey University. So if you find me on Google Scholar and sort by year, you can look and find pretty easily the entries. You can see what research I've been doing in marketing and climate science and other areas. But you can also find those publications in mindfulness and clinical psychological science and click through and read them because they are open access. Hopefully they're approachable to a general audience as well.
I would think so. It seemed approachable to me to contact you. So, Malcolm, what now we have the next generation of scholars coming. What are some of the questions you want them to answer? You hope can be
Oh,
answered.
I think they should find their own questions. I would want them to be curious and also responsible for their own learning, not expecting anybody else to do it. And just to take the view of, wow, what can I be? What can I achieve? How can I flourish? How can I innovate? And just have fun and do it on their own terms. It's hard because there are such hierarchies in academia and so many things that you kind of have to do. And so to some extent, you've got to satisfy those hierarchical needs. But I would say, do it as a hygiene factor and then just do what you love and find out the fantastic things you can find out and don't be hidebound by tradition and listen to the old senior scholars a little bit. Yeah, definitely, but not too much.
Thank you, Malcolm. And I think I would add and not cling. Is that right?
Exactly.